Me. Okay, all right. So with that, I want to welcome you all back to our third part of our Building Strong Brains Collective Impact virtual workshop series. And as you all know, since its inception, Building Strong Brains has connected brain science and communication science to change the culture in Tennessee to be informed by ACEs, trauma, and resilience. And so really this series is meant to help us continue with our mission of changing the culture in the state and improving outcomes for all Tennessee children and families. With your leadership and collaboration, we hope this series will support communities to build safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments that better prevent ACEs and build resilience. We want to thank the Tennessee Department of Health for co-hosting this series with us and for Camelot for allowing us to use their online platform. We remind everyone that you are on mute and will be unable to unmute yourself. Please post questions in the chat box for the presenter's response at the end of the presentation and throughout the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth YouTube page. Finally, please fill out the survey that pops up at the end of the webinar and let us know if you'd be interested in joining any kind of knowledge mobilization team or community effort in your area. If you're interested in receiving notice of future Building Strong Brains webinar opportunities, feel free to email me, Jen Drake-Croft, at jen.croft, C-R-O-F-T, at tn.gov. Now, Melissa says that most of you are rejoining us, so there is no reason to read her illustrious bio. So we're going to skip that for today in the interest of time. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to pass it off to Melissa and share my screen.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks for everyone who has rejoined for our third webinar and workshop together. It's delightful to see you all today. I myself could not believe it when I was flipping my calendar over that it's now June. Time is just completely flying by. So I look forward to our final couple of workshops together. So today, just to share a bit about what we'll be covering, we'll be talking about the common agenda and backbone role. We'll be building on some of the things that we shared last time on common agenda and didn't get to, and then talking more in depth with the backbone. We'll be hearing from the Strong ACC again today. And so you can look forward to not just hearing me talk for the next 2 hours, but we'll have some activities for you all and a guest speaker from the Strong ACC again to try to mix things up a bit. For those of you who maybe didn't get a chance to meet me virtually in our last workshops, I come from social sector consulting. I spent 13 years at Foundation Strategy Group, or FSG, doing collective impact work. And so now I'm doing a lot of these types of webinars and coaching to bring these best practices and ways to think about implementing collective impact in your own community. So I look forward to sharing some of these things, as well as just learning from all of you in the chat, etc. So as Jen mentioned, we'll have you all muted. You'll be able to talk in the breakout rooms. If you're not in a place where you can join a big breakout room and have a discussion, please just stay in the main room so we can kind of see that and make sure that folks who do want to engage in a dialogue with others have enough peers in their breakout room. And if you do have questions as we go through today's agenda, feel free to put that in the chat. So we'll spend about a half hour on the common agenda and doing an activity on that we didn't get to last time. We'll spend the bulk of today diving into the backbone role, which is really critical to the success of collective impact efforts. And then we'll, if we have time at the end, touch on systems leadership and an activity there. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. I wanted to just share, if you go to the next slide, Jen, a quick refresher on the common agenda in case there are folks who weren't here last time. So if you all remember, there's 5 elements that make collective impact different from other forms of collaboration. On the next slide, Jen, sorry, slipped backwards. So the common agenda is just one of 5. So I'll just briefly highlight the 5 to ground us. So the common agenda is really a shared vision and ways that you're going to achieve that vision and putting it down on paper. Shared measurement is how you're going to define that success. So really saying, what's our North Star? How will we know if we've achieved our goal? Mutually reinforcing activities, for those of you who were on the last webinar will remember that I hate this phrase because it's so jargony, but it's the most important piece of collective impact. It says all the different actors who are around a table from different sectors and perspectives, you're each doing something distinct, but yet all of those distinct activities complement one another. So you're not all doing the same thing, you're doing different things, but they really come together to create some incredible impact on the community. Continuous communication means you're coming together and talking and sharing and doing things together. And then lastly, the backbone support is the dedicated staff who wakes up every day to just think about coordination of the effort. It is their job. It's not off the side of their desk. And we'll define that and talk more about that today. So on the common agenda, if you remember, we broke this down and said, what makes a strong common agenda? And typically we see 5 things. One is principles, defining how you want to work together. So we see a lot of things here about making sure various diverse perspectives are at the table, having a commitment to equity, doing community engagement really well. So this is all the how that folks want to commit to doing collaboration really well together. The problem definition is the second piece, and this is important to put boundaries on things. So a lot of collective impact efforts have a broad goal, a broad vision of transforming the education system or alleviating poverty in a community. And so the problem definition phase is really helpful to put boundaries on what is this coalition about? What's in and what's out in terms of a problem definition. So if you're talking about poverty alleviation, are you talking about the K through 12 education system, or are you talking more about employment after the K through 12 education system, for example? The goal is kind of the inverse of the problem, right? So once you've set some boundaries around your problem, then what are you striving to achieve? The framework for change is then breaking down that goal and saying, what are the different parts of the problem or ways we want to achieve this goal? And when we talk later about structures, typically that's how you might think about work groups or committees to say, we have this big goal, but what are some of the initial priorities that we want to focus on within that goal? And then lastly, the plan for learning is how will you track progress and learn? So this is setting some milestones to know how are you moving forward? How do you know you're making progress towards your goal? Knowing that a lot of times that goal is going to be really long term and you won't see the immediate population level result, but you'll want to track some milestones towards that. So those are the 5 elements, and we talked about those in a bit more detail last time. So if you weren't able to attend that workshop, feel free to get that recording if you're interested in seeing some more examples about these 5 elements. So if we go to the next slide, we wanted to do a quick poll to get warmed up. So we want to know which component, based on those 5 I just described, is most challenging for you. And so you'll see you should be able to just click. Right now, the poll should have been up on your screen, and let us know which one's most challenging. Give you a couple minutes here. All right. Give you about 10 more seconds. If you didn't vote yet, go ahead and vote, and then we can close it out and show folks the results. All right. Jen, are you able to end that and display results for folks? Okay, perfect. Let me see. I don't know if you all can see the results. Let's see, share. Can everybody see the results on their screen? Okay. So it looks like about a third of you, the highest one was framework for change. How are you going to split up the work and prioritize? So we'll talk a bit more about that today, followed by the problem definition. And I agree, those are kind of the 2 areas that you have to make some tough calls of what's in and what's out, and how are you going to prioritize then what you're doing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our small groups, that maybe you can get some advice from folks who have done this well, or brainstorm ways if you're all kind of stuck. So if we go to the next slide, Jen. What we want to do is send you all into some breakout discussions. And so I'll put the worksheet in the chat in a moment. But what we want you to do, you may have also got that, you should have gotten this worksheet attached as a Word document in the link that Jen sent through today as well, or yesterday, sorry. So you can either access it there, or I do have a Google Doc. I'll put it in the chat right now. So what we want you to do is to spend a few minutes reflecting on your own, on the 5 elements of the common agenda, to say, if I think about an initiative or effort that we are working on, what's the status of this? You know, in progress, completed, not started. What's one success you've had in getting agreement on that element, and what's a next step you might take? So we're going to give you about 5 minutes to think about this on your own. And then we'll send you off into groups to discuss. And what we want you to share is introduce yourselves, because this will be the first time you're in breakout groups today. And just share what's one success or one challenge that you've had, and what's the next step, so that we can hear from one another, and people might be inspired from some of the successes and learn from one another. So we'll do about 5 minutes of reflection, and then we'll send you out to the breakout groups for about 10 or 15 minutes. And just feel free to send in the chat to me or Jen if you're having trouble either accessing the Google Doc or finding that Word document in your email. All right, everyone's slowly coming back in. Welcome back. Hope you had good conversations with one another. And we're going to move to the next section just to keep things moving along. But if you have any observations of things you learned in your breakouts, would love to hear from you in the chat. Just one thing you learned, maybe you were inspired by someone else, an idea that you gathered. That would be great to hear. And if you also had questions that came up, feel free to put those in the chat. I'll look at those when we take a break in a bit and respond to them after the break. So feel free to put either things you learned or questions that came up for you in the chat as we continue moving along. So next, if we move to the next slide, we'll talk for a bit about the backbone role. You know, this is a piece that folks typically have a lot of questions about. What is the backbone? What should they be doing? How does it interact with all the other pieces? So I have some content here I'm going to go through fairly quickly. If questions are coming up as we're going through, please feel free to put questions in the chat. I have lots of other resources I can follow up with about the backbone role, but I'm just going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes going through these slides quickly, and then we'll respond to questions as they come up. So on the next slide is a picture. And I'm going to walk you through this picture of the structures of collective impact. So when you first look at this picture, one of the first takeaways is this is not your typical hierarchical organizational chart that you see. And that's by intention. That collective impact is typically designed to balance both an intentionality in terms of the structures and clear roles and responsibilities, as well as uncertainty. If anything, we've all learned over the last year that structures have to be nimble and agile and change based on changes in our context. And so as you're thinking about your structures, keep in mind that this is definitely an art and a science. And so I'm going to just walk you through these pieces here, and then I have some more detail on the following slides. So just bear with me as I kind of do a bit of a voiceover here. So starting in the upper right-hand corner, we have our steering committee. And so typically a steering committee is made up of all of the leaders of the various organizations that need to be at the table to solve a problem. So these are typically the executive directors, C-levels, and you're really trying to get folks around a table to start a different type of dialogue about what can we all do together? How can we align on what the problem is we want to solve? How can we collectively generate better results than we can each do individually in our day jobs, in our organizations? And so the steering committee, getting those groups of leaders together is really to say, what is our vision? How can we all be bought into this and get aligned? How can we be champions for this work in our community? And so it's really setting the strategy. Typically, the steering committee is what is making that common agenda, of course, with input from the community, from others who are not at this table, but really setting and guiding that overall strategy. And typically, we would recommend that a steering committee be about 20 or so folks. When you get larger than that, it can get a bit unwieldy and you don't get as frequent participation as you may like. Smaller than that is tough because then you're not being inclusive. So you're normally looking for about 15 to 25 leaders in a room together. The way you get others involved is on the right-hand side here, the work groups. So when we talked about in our common agenda, the framework for change, we're really talking about work groups, which are typically structured around different parts of the problem. So for example, I spent quite a bit of time, I think I mentioned on our last call, working on juvenile justice. So the work groups were centered around different problems in the community related to juvenile justice. So there was one group that was focused on how to make families more empowered and involved in the juvenile justice system. There was another very broad group focused just on community prevention. There was another group focused on case processing. How do you make sure that that process, if you're in the justice system, is clear and transparent, people are being treated with dignity and respect. There was another group just focused on data. There's another group focused on policy. That's usually pretty typical in a lot of collective impact efforts, that for things that are cross-cutting like data or policy, you may have a separate group of folks who are really experts in that kind of function. So I think of the work groups as kind of the different parts of the problem or priorities that you want to advance. Typically, work groups are made up of more of the frontline workers, so folks in the juvenile justice experience who are really working with youth every day, the probation officers, the law enforcement folks in community-based organizations who interact with youth every day and who typically don't have a say in what community level strategy is. They're typically not asked or engaged. They're told what to do from the top down. And so work groups can be really empowering in a way to get buy-in and momentum from folks who are working on the ground, on the front lines every single day and have incredible ideas of what change needs to happen, but typically they're not empowered to make that change. You'll see that we have kind of the purple dots here for community partners. So these may be folks that you bring in for a certain meeting or two, or to help with a certain strategy or activity or idea that you have. But you have those work groups who typically around 10 to 12, 15 maximum folks around the table. You have a couple of chairs who help really guide and convene and facilitate those groups. And then there's connections back to the steering committee. So sometimes there's folks who sit on the steering committee and they also are a chair or participant in the work group, so that you have that alignment and coordination across. But on the left-hand side, the backbone support, that really is the key to alignment and coordination. So you have some of it by sharing membership across the steering committee and work groups. But the backbone, as I mentioned earlier, is an individual or a set of individual staff members who wake up every day to think about coordination and collaboration and really work to provide that capacity to the folks who are volunteering here in the collective impact effort and doing it in addition to their day jobs to make their jobs more easy. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about that as we continue here. So I would like to go to the next slide, I think, and talk about, okay, when we were trying to recruit for your steering committee, we just talked about that the role is really to guide the strategy and to be champions for the effort in the community. So who do you want at the table? So there are a few things to think about because this is often hard to get your list down to 20 leaders. If you click again, Jen, there's several traits that in the individuals that you want to attract. So as I mentioned earlier, decision makers. You want people who can really make policy change and implement practices at their organizations and influence others. You want diversity. You want to make sure that the groups around the individuals around the table represent racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, and geography that is reflective of the community. right? I think you want folks who are committed and passionate about this issue. And I think most important is you want people who are focused on the greater interest. So even though they may be a CEO of an organization that has certain metrics and goals, they're not just at the table representing their organization, but they're at the table representing the greater good of the community. And that's really important. There's also an important element here of having lived experience at the table. So this may be through the leaders. There may be people who are leaders of organizations that have lived experience in that topic. And if not, or in addition to that, you want folks from the community kind of at the steering committee level able to give their input, and for the leaders to hear from community members themselves as the strategy is being set. So on the flip side, if you click one more time, Jen, what are the traits that you want to avoid? You don't want too much agreement, because you want to kind of do things differently, but you also don't want too much disagreement. So it's finding this very delicate balance between making sure you're working together differently, but there's not too much tension or just fractured relationships among people are in the room. You want to make sure that people are able to listen to others and be open to different perspectives. If people are very polarizing, or they're only coming to the table because of funding, they're probably not the right individual to be at this table. That all being said, there's sometimes critical stakeholders that you need at the table, and yet they have some of these traits in the avoid column. So finding allies in the community who have a good relationship with those individuals, that can talk to them about the importance of this, that can, in a productive way, have a dialogue about how they might need to change how they're showing up, is really important and critical to the effort's success to move forward. Okay, next slide, Jen. Just a few things, having put together steering committees in different communities across the country, just to point out, I've kind of been alluding to some of these, but to make them explicit. A lot of times the steering committee, what's really important is forming deeper relationships among leaders, and it can be even more important than the output in terms of the common agenda. I mentioned this last time when we were together, that the common agenda in terms of a strategic plan on paper is critically important, but the process by which you get there is more important than the output. And that's also the same for steering committee members. So creating time in the meetings for people to get to know each other, have deep dialogue, is really important to form those relationships, because that's going to pay off outside of the meetings. This takes a lot of time to create that time and space for people to connect on a different level in these meetings and outside. And so you may start to feel, the third thing on this list here is a tension between speed and inclusion. So if you want to move really fast and you want to get through the common agenda creation process in a few months, you can move really quickly and get some people at the table, or say it's okay if some people are not involved or included, but that will be at the price of not going deep on some of these issues, or making sure that all perspectives are at the table. Facilitation really matters. Having a backbone individual or facilitator who can truly be neutral and bringing people together, and that everyone around the steering committee table trusts, is critically important to make sure that that person's always listening for what is the shared common ground here, and doesn't have their own agenda that they're trying to move forward. And then lastly, I mentioned that you want people who are committed and coming to meetings over a certain amount of time. That is definitely true. You don't want a lot of turnover. You don't want people missing meetings and having gaps and like, what are we doing and where are we headed? And at the same time, being open to the groups being fluid, that if you identify, hey, we're missing this certain geography, or we don't have racial or ethnic diversity, how do you invite those perspectives to the table? Or as priorities shift, how do you say, okay, we're going to focus a lot more on prevention of juvenile justice now. So maybe we need less folks who are as deeply involved in the system to make space at the table for those who are more focused on prevention, for example. So being open to that fluidity of the group is also important. For the next slide, just to talk a little bit about work group members and how they're similar or different from steering committee. I mentioned that they're usually the frontline workers who have more experience with folks in the community and are on kind of the on the ground perspective. And therefore they're creating the strategies and ways to measure progress towards those strategies. So the steering committee may say, here's our framework for change. We're going to have work groups in these 3 areas. These are our top 3 priorities. But the steering committee is not being prescriptive and saying, we think you need to do these 5 things over the next 12 months. The work group should be saying, based on our experience, where we see there's huge gaps in the community, where we see there's already really strong momentum, we think we should start here versus there. And so coming up with both using data in the sense of community data, quantitative data, as well as qualitative data based on experience to say, here's how we think we should work on this part of the problem. So that's the strategy and indicator development. One more click, Jen. Then implementation. The work group members is called a work group because this is where the work happens. So making sure that certain commitments and activities that are identified actually happen. And this doesn't mean that the work group members, those 10 or 12 or 15 individuals are doing all of the work, but they're going out and finding others to kind of help with doing the strategy implementation. And then lastly, one more click, Jen, leadership. So this is related to that last point, which is saying committed to the work and also going out and getting others excited about this work when you need new community partners to come in to get them to be involved or align their work to what the priorities are. Okay, backbone. This was a slide from last time just to talk about how unique the backbone role is. They're kind of a leader from behind. So they're a quarterback. They're not ending up in the end zone, but pulling it off and coordinating as you get there. They're working behind the scenes or serving as a bridge. These are all different analogies used when we asked backbone leaders to describe their role. So what exactly are backbones doing? We'll talk about that on the next slide. So typically a backbone has 6 key functions. They're guiding the vision and strategy. So this really lies within the steering committee, but as the key facilitator, the neutral facilitator, the backbone staff is building a common understanding of the problem and then helping the steering committee land and agree upon a common agenda. Once that's done, the real work of the backbone is to support aligned activities. So what this means is making sure that steps are being taken to start to implement that common agenda. So this is continuing to bring people together, to move forward with priorities, provide technical assistance, bring in people as needed. And so this is really that supporting the coordination and alignment is super important. Establishing shared measurement practices. So this is saying, how do we gather data that we need to make decisions and assess our progress? Cultivating community engagement. So this is making sure that this effort is not just sitting with the steering committee or work groups, but others in the communities are being involved along the way to give input to what the priorities are, to help with implementation. And then lastly, supporting policy and resource mobilization. So this is saying when macro things come up with policies, how do we make sure this group is kind of catalyzed to support policies that are aligned with the common agenda? And how do we make sure there's resources to support the implementation of the common agenda? So you can see how all of the verbs here are guide, support, cultivate, advance. So it is this leader from behind to support all the activities of the initiative. On the next slide, I just wanted to distinguish what really the skill set is required to kind of do those types of activities. So first, just to make it explicit, this needs to be dedicated staff. Those types of things are not going to happen by accident or off the side of folks' desk as easily as having dedicated staff. They need to be neutral and build key relationships so people are bought in and feel a good sense of ownership for this work. And then I think a really important one to point out here is that they need to frame issues to present opportunities and difficulties. So making sure there's this constant balance between here's the challenges in our community, but here's how we can work on them. A lot of myths about the community, the backbone from folks we've heard in the past is they don't set the agenda. They may provide input to what the priorities should be. But I always say when I'm facilitating steering committee meetings, I don't really care what the group chooses as its goal or priority. I just care that there's a choice being made, that there's some kind of action being taken. The backbone does not drive the solutions or even get all the funding. There is funding to support the staff member, but they're not getting all of the funding to do all of the activities that will flow to other organizations. And then is self-appointed rather than selected by the community. We see a lot of times folks raising their hand and saying, I'll serve as the backbone. And sometimes that works if that organization has trust and credibility in the community. And a lot of times it does not work because it's lacking those key relationships. And so having a transparent process by which the backbone is selected by those involved is really important. On the next slide, just a few traits that we see of the individual staff member who typically takes on this role. They're results oriented, focused but adaptive, humble, a good communicator. So just a few things to keep in mind if you're thinking about hiring someone, that these are some of the successful characteristics. So what do we mean by a backbone structure? It's important to know, I'm just going to jump to number 3 here. It looks different across communities. There's no one size fits all approach here. It really is thinking about when we talk about backbone structure, we're talking about the core staffing and leadership, like who is actually doing this coordination work. And when we talk about the structure, we may be talking about a convener or a fiscal agent or an organization that's kind of behind that individual. So on the next slide, just to give you an idea of how we break this down so that we're not conflating a bunch of things, is first starting with sizing structure. If you click Jen, I think twice. There we go. Thinking through how many full-time employers do we need to do the backbones work? And will that person or people that we hire sit in a new organization? Will we create a new 501c3 or will they be in an existing organization? Also thinking about who they report to, like what's the chain of command, who's responsible for hiring, firing, assessing their performance is really important. Then also thinking, if you click again, Jen, the selection process is important. So are you thinking about first saying who should that fiscal agent be, or who is the organization, and then they hire the staff? Or are we going to hire the person and figure out where they sit later? And then lastly, the funding sources. Click one more time, Jen, thank you. Who will fund that person's salary? And then what's the long-term funding plan? So I often find it helpful because the backbone structures, which you'll see through our examples in just a minute, can be quite complex to kind of break down these different decisions and take them one by one. Because a lot of times when you're getting into the dialogue with the steering committee about the staffing, people can start conflating all these different decisions, and it can be confusing. So if we go to the next slide, as I said, there's no one size fits all. So we've seen all these different types of structures. We've seen a backbone be a standalone nonprofit, a new 501c3. This is oftentimes when there is no neutral organization in the community that kind of spans the issue that's being solved. We also see the fiscal sponsorship approach a lot, that the backbone is technically housed in another organization that really serves as that back office and employer. We see a braided backbone structure a lot, where it's some of those functions that we talked about are housed across multiple organizations. We see a lot of funders like United Ways and community foundations hosting the backbone role, as well as government. And we also see some shared responsibility, especially if there isn't budget to hire a staff. The leader, the steering committee takes on the backbone role and kind of says, well, I have a person who can dedicate 25% of their time to data, or I have someone who's a really good facilitator and they can spend 10 hours a week supporting this. So having kind of that shared structure we've also seen. On the next slide, what are some of the roles? I'm going to just go through this quickly just in the interest of time, but you can refer back to this, or I can share more resources to folks who are thinking about hiring backbone staff. I have lots of them. But typically we see kind of 3 roles being important for a larger collective impact effort. First is just an overall director who's really serving as that champion to get people at the table, get them to align, and to think about the priorities and just get going with the work. There's also oftentimes a data manager. If you're doing a lot of evaluation or measurement, having someone who's just thinking about data. And then depending on the size of the effort, there may be additional facilitators who are helping to support the project director if there's, say, a lot of work groups. Now, all of these folks don't have to be full-time. They don't have to be year-round. They don't have to be, they can be contractors. There's a lot of creativity in how folks do this in terms of putting together the support that's needed for the backbone role. So on the next slide, unfortunately, Kylan couldn't be here today due to a conflict, but she did share with me the Nashville braided backbone structure. And I know a few folks on the line are also familiar with this. So I'll just share an overview of this, and then I'll also pass it off to Mark Cruz at the Strong ACC to share their example to try to bring this to life a bit. So by braided structure, what we mean is kind of that combined housing the backbone across multiple organizations. And what's interesting to me about the ACE Nashville story is that they originally put out an RFP to think about one single backbone organization, but then they realized after having many conversations and seeing what was out there, that the braided backbone would better serve the community's needs. And so 3 roles are separated across 3 organizations, and that happen to represent 3 different sectors. So the nonprofit partner there in the middle is Nurture the Next. And so they act as the fiscal agent. So they receive all the grants and then they pay all the bills and kind of serve as that back office and administrative support. The Meharry Medical College is the higher ed partner, and they help with data. So as I mentioned, that's usually a very technical skill set. And so that is housed in the Office for Research there. And then lastly, the Metro Public Health represents the public sector, and they're also administrative backbone partner. So that is where Kylan is employed. Although her position was funded by members of the Middle Tennessee Donors Forum, and the money goes to Nurture the Next, that then pays Metro Public Health for her salary. And she's the only FTE at this point. And so you can see this is a creative solution to kind of sharing the work and enhancing collaboration in my mind. When I see these shared models, it does really help in making that shared accountability we've been talking about put into practice. So I asked Kylan when we had a chance to talk before this webinar about what some of the successes and challenges were with this structure. So with the successes, she said it actually works very smoothly. All the backbone partners serve on the leadership team. They're very involved and embedded in the work. And she said this really helps the public understand that the ACE Nashville belongs to the community and not one organization. And that is what I see also as the #1 benefit of a braided structure. In terms of challenges, she wasn't around when this was initially set up, but she said it has some pretty specific and complex MOU and contracts to really make explicit, how does this work? Who's doing what? What is the accountability? So she said, I would imagine it was an involved process, and hopefully others on the line could speak to that if there's questions. But that I also see a lot of the time in this work that you have to make it very transparent about how this is going to work at the beginning, so then everyone feels at ease about the shared ownership and accountability. So with that, I will hand it off to Mark Cruz to talk about the strong ACC. If Mark, you don't mind doing it, just a short introduction and then sharing your example of the backbone structure.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning. Let's see, is it good afternoon for some? Good mornings for others. Great to be with you all today. And thanks again for the invitation, Melissa and Jen, to present today. I'm Mark Cruz. I'm the new director for the Strong ACC. I'm the first full-time employee hired by our Collective Impact Project. And I'm going to share a few remarks about our backbone structure. And Melissa, you provided a nice foundation for this presentation. I'll touch on a few of the things that you mentioned. So next slide, please. So I too was not around during these formative months going back to 2000, all the way back to 2018. But in that time frame, there was a merger of 2 regional health systems in Southwest Virginia and Northeast Tennessee that resulted in the formation of Ballad Health, and so the Strong ACC was formed out of the numerous community discussions and dialogues that occurred during that time that really grew out of the notion that Ballad Health was to be more than just a large integrated health system with 21 hospitals covering 2 states and 21 counties, but in addition, it was really focused on becoming a community health improvement organization. And so there were population health goals established that were part of the agreements with the state of Tennessee and the Commonwealth of Virginia that helped make the merger possible. So BALLAD in its formation really set the stage for an enormous dialogue and planning process that took place with literally hundreds of community organizations in Southwest Virginia and Northeast Tennessee to identify what the region could do collectively to address some of the vexing health and social challenges in a more coordinated and systemic fashion. And so BALLAD Health was a key player in the early days and sort of naturally became a backbone. I don't think that there was any sort of a recruitment and vetting and approval process for BALLAD Health. It just was a natural outcome of many of the community dialogues and discussions that were happening around the merger. A decision was made very consciously early on by BALLAD Health leaders to utilize the collective impact model. That was a very conscious decision and made based on knowledge and awareness of the success of the collective impact model around the country in bringing about systemic change. So this was embedded in our DNA from the earliest stages and has served us well ever since. Early on, BALLAD identified an organization, the United Way of Southwest Virginia, that really was a logical choice to become a fellow backbone partner focused in Southwest Virginia. And really because of its success in bringing about systemic change in health and education and income security, the United Way really was a logical choice. And then there was a need to identify a similar strong backbone partner in Northeast Tennessee, and an organization called Healthy Kingsport was chosen to fill that role. It was and is a dynamic organization really focused on health promotion and activities to foster healthy lifestyles in the Kingsport community. So here you have three organizations that formed kind of a tripartite backbone structure. And, with BALLAD being a large multi-state integrated health system with a lot of reach and a lot of influence, a lot of resources, along with two very well-respected organizations in each of the two states served. And so the three of those organizations really came together in a nice way to get things rolling. And so next slide. Along a pretty early on, there was a leadership change at Healthy Kingsport, and during that time, a new strategic plan was established, and the board and leadership of Healthy Kingsport decided to step away as a backbone partner. It wasn't going to be part of their mission or purpose for the coming years, and so they decided to step away. And it was an amicable separation, and Strong ACC continues to have a very good relationship with Healthy Kingsport. So then that left just the two organizations, BALLAD Health and United Way, who are today the current backbone organizations. BALLAD Health it is providing financial support to the United Way in the form of a 3-year grant to support their costs associated with being a backbone organization. And so starting in late 2018 and then really going headlong into 2019 and 2020, an extensive planning process was launched that resulted in Strong ACC's strategic plan. And the two backbone organizations provided the bulk of the facilitation, all of the logistics around convening groups, to have focus groups, to have learning sessions, to engage in looking at various aspects of the region's health and well-being, education, economic vitality, early childhood development. And the backbone organizations created the spaces and the forums and the wherewithal for that planning to occur. I'll say also that the way that you mentioned, Melissa, work groups and also a steering team or steering committee. Let me say that an early precursor to work groups were what we called sector committees that were organized into 4 different committees, each comprised of people from a specific sector. And those 4 sectors were business, education, healthcare, and community-based and faith-based organizations. And so each of those sector committees really came together to look at the same set of data and dynamics and conditions that each of the others were looking at, but really viewed it through the lens of their particular sector and came up with ideas and strategies that eventually were shared with the rest of the committees. And out of that, a lot of assimilation and combination of ideas were put together that became eventually the strategic plan. Next slide, please. So these 3 individuals really played a key pivotal role in terms of the backbone organization's work in guiding the planning and direction of the Strong ACC. Todd Norris is Senior Vice President for Community Relations and Strategic Initiatives at Ballad. Am I back? Okay, sorry about that. Dr. Paula Masters, who you met last time, is the Vice President for Health Programs at Ballad. And then Travis Staten is the President and CEO of the United Way of Southwest Virginia. And the 3 of them really tag teamed the facilitation of the extensive regional planning process, the sector committees, and each, and you characterized this well, Melissa, each took great pains to remain neutral on the issues and really kind of helped facilitate in an objective, impartial way the sector committees and what became a leadership council that provided the basis for the overall direction and governance of the Strong ACC. Next slide, please. So this picture, which Dr. Masters shared last time, and it's worth sharing again because we're trying to put things into some context here, shows the 2 backbone organizations of the Strong ACC with this leadership council that really has taken the bulk of the responsibility and authority and decision-making for the direction of Strong ACC on to itself. This is a 24-member council comprised of a broad cross-section of leaders from various sectors in the region and true decision makers. You'll see in a minute some examples of those folks And then underneath the Leadership Council are these committees which were formed to help address certain aspects of the Strong ACC's work at the behest and at the pleasure of the Leadership Council. These committees directly underneath are all made up of Leadership Council members and meet either monthly or every other month to make sure that the council has what it needs to do its work. And then below that is the membership of the ACC, which now numbers more than 300 organizations from a variety of interests and backgrounds in the 21 county, 2-state region. And then most recently, we have formed work groups that are today's version of the work groups, as you were mentioning, Melissa. And these are aligned with each of the 4 projects that we are taking on this year as part of in pursuant to the strategic plan. These work groups are established to help guide and steer and advise each of the 4 main projects that we are engaged in this year. And so that's the structure as it exists today. Next slide, please. Here's that Leadership Council, and these are decision makers. These are influencers. These are people who can make things happen in our 2-state region. And as you can see, there's a diverse array of people and organizations who each in their own way have a stake in the health and well-being of our region. Folks from education and public health and business and healthcare and workforce development and philanthropy, and the list goes on. And this has become a really cohesive group. I would also say that it's blessed with tremendous leadership from the chair and the vice chair. Dr. Karen Skatsina is chair. She's a pediatrician and professor in ETSU's College of Medicine and heads up the Child and Family Health Institute. She is absolutely wonderful as a facilitator. She's very adept at making sure that all voices are heard and respected and valued, and just does a tremendous job. And then the vice chair, who is Dennis Carter, Dr. Dennis Carter, superintendent of Smith County Public Schools. On the Virginia side, we wanted to make sure that there was representation from both states in the 2 top positions. And so he's been tasked with some responsibilities as vice chair to complement what Dr. Skatsina does. And the 2 of them are a tremendous team at the top. And so they really have created a culture that this Leadership Council has adopted that really is driving the Strong ACC at this point and will continue to for the foreseeable future, and has really assumed control of this Strong ACC in terms of direction, timing, issues, etc. If any of that was done by the backbones before, it's now really in the hands of the Leadership Council. Next slide, please.
Okay.
Next slide, please. So last fall, the backbone organizations, with the blessing of the Leadership Council, thought the time had come to create a full-time position that would be responsible for the Strong ACC's day-to-day management. And so a job description was created, and a leadership, a search process was created with the help of a search committee from the Leadership Council and help from Ballot Health's Human Resources Department. As a result of that search process, I was hired, and I began in March, and with the charge to quarterback the strong ACC. And that was a term that was actually used, Melissa, in describing my role. And I thought it was ironic that that came through as one of the examples of the words used to describe backbone support. And so I'm now in about my 12th week on the job, and drinking from a fire hose, as they say, but it's all good. Ballot Health provides my salary and provides office space for me to work, and the necessary IT and communications apparatus to do my work. I report to the Leadership Council, and the role of the backbone organizations, and particularly Todd and Paula and Travis, has shifted a bit to being more of a sort of a support and guidance function for me, giving advice and ideas and suggestions, but with the understanding that I report to the Leadership Council, and that the council is really the governing body of the strong ACC. So I kind of see myself as a bridge between the backbones and the Leadership Council, working collaboratively with both, not so much in a hierarchical fashion, but really in a collaborative partnership fashion. As an example, this isn't on the slide, but as an example of how this plays out in real life, I asked that we create what I call a management team, which actually comprises the three backbone leaders I mentioned, two from Ballot Health, one from the United Way of Southwest Virginia, along with the chair and vice chair of our Leadership Council, and myself, to meet once a month, to just make sure that we're all on the same page with the work of the strong ACC, the agenda for the Leadership Council, any issues that are bubbling up that we need to kind of proactively address, and it becomes a nice close-in sounding board for me to vet ideas and strategies before I run with them. So that management team now is a critical piece that's a bridge between the backbones and the Leadership Council, that's helping me as the lone full-time employee be able to stay on the right track and get the job done. So I'll stop there, Melissa, and happy to answer questions now or when the time comes.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your experience. I'm really glad you touched on that management team piece at the end. We do find that I do a lot of coaching with backbone staff, and it can be a really lonely job because you have no boss, yet a lot of bosses. So finding ways to put those structures kind of in between so you can have a thought partner and guidance and people to brainstorm with is really important. And we use both analogies, quarterback and bridge. So it's, yeah, many, many ways to describe the backbone role. The two other things that I just want to point out that you mentioned to make them extra obvious to folks is how fluid your structures were. So you were at first, the strong ACC was organized by sector when you're doing the strategic planning, and then pivoted to these other work groups that were more focused on the strategies or activities. So I think that's really important, as well as the shift that was more obvious in terms of the backbone structure based on the evolving needs. And I'll just point out that the strong ACC was really intentional, that at the end of 2019, they did a developmental evaluation, which involved surveying all of the members of the ACC and doing interviews with the Leadership Council members to talk about, what's going well. Where do we have challenges? And a lot of those changes, they would have happened more organically anyway, is what I'm guessing. But doing that kind of progress assessment helped create the time and space for people to give their feedback and then have a discussion about those changes. So again, it wasn't just valid, for example, making the call of making those changes. It was collective kind of brainstorming and reflection on what needed to change in kind of the next phase of the strong ECC, very, very intentionally. So thank you. So I realize we've been going for 90 minutes. Okay, welcome back, folks. You can hear me. We'll get started again. I don't see any questions come in. If you just used your break to stretch and you do have anything on your mind, feel free to share it in the chat and we'll be sure to address those at the end. So just to touch briefly on our last topic today, Jen, if you go to the next slide of systems leadership. So we've been talking a lot about the 5 conditions, and there's been kind of this backdrop of systems leadership. What is it? How do you lead in this different way? Especially after talking about the backbone, I thought it would be helpful to touch on this. So if you go to the next slide, Jen. The way I think about this is that we've been talking a lot about, as I just mentioned, the 5 conditions of a backbone, communication, the mutually reinforcing activities, measurement, common agenda. What really binds them all together or kind of sits at the top is systems leadership. If you click one more time, Jen. So what do we mean by leadership and kind of systems leadership? So on the next slide, just try to define this a little bit. There's certain adaptive or systems leadership capabilities that we see as being really important for the backbone role, as well as for steering committee members and work group members. So a lot of times it's the responsibility of the backbone leader to really understand these capabilities and bring them in terms of capacity building to the others that are doing the collective impact work. So what are those types of capabilities? So the first we see is shifting collective focus from reactive problem solving to co-creation. I was on the phone this morning with some of your colleagues in West Tennessee, and they were saying, folks who had these types of coalitions or the muscles of collaboration kind of in practice or in play before COVID were able to react better, right? So rather than just doing reactive problem solving, they were already they already had a collective focus and collaboration. So they could say, okay, if we're getting funding for COVID, or we need to bring people together to react and do things in a different way, you're able to do that better if you kind of have that foundation. And so we'll practice a tool today called appreciative inquiry that can help bring groups together and kind of put that co-creation into focus for one another. The second is fostering reflective and generative conversations. So another tool to do this is called learning journeys, of really looking at how have you been learning? What can you take away from that? And have generative conversations. I have another slide that I'll get to in a moment of all types of facilitation tools and links to those tools to really say, how do we go beyond just talking or sharing best practices or sharing our experiences to generating new ideas? And so that's what really that second capability is all about. And the third one is being able to see the system in which actors are embedded. And there's a tool called actor mapping that can help with that. I talk about this juvenile justice example a lot, and one of the most interesting things about my time there was I had no experience with the juvenile justice system in Omaha. And so I was sitting down with stakeholders saying, can you draw me a picture of like how the system works? Like, what are the parts? How do they all connect? Because that was something we were hearing from youth and families, which was the system is a black box. So we were trying to draw the picture for youth and families. And we realized that the practitioners who make up the system itself actually couldn't draw it on a piece of paper because they were responsible for their part of the system. And so that's kind of a visual of when we say we're working in silos, it's we might know a little bit of who comes before us in the system or after, kind of the close friends around us, but thinking about the whole system can be totally overwhelming. And so how can these groups together create a visual to understand how the system interacts and kind of the relationships amongst folks in the system. So to just talk briefly about appreciative inquiry a bit more, I love appreciative inquiry as a tool because it's asset-based and really focuses on positivity. It looks to the past to say what's worked well before and how can we use that to solve the problems that are in front of us. It really focuses on when have we been at our best and how can we learn from that to then chart a path forward. Go to the next slide. One more, Jen. Yep, here we go. It has 4 phases. Sorry, got a little glitch there. So it has 4 phases. Today we're gonna focus on the inquire phase. So this is looking backwards about what has worked in the past. When have we been at our best? The second phase is the visioning phase, saying, okay, if we could envision the best possible outcome for our community, what would it be and how do we get there? And then the phases 3 and 4, which I personally have used less, is really then moving into that future and saying, how would we actually implement against this? How would we come up with strategies and activities and putting together a plan? Just to briefly, we're not going to go through actor mapping together, but to give you just a brief overview, it's a visual depiction, as I said, about the key organizations or individuals that influence a system. It's really important that you've started the common agenda process and put some boundaries around the problem. Doing that problem definition is important before you do actor mapping, because you're starting to say, okay, within these boundaries, who needs to be involved and what are the current relationships look like? You click 2 more times, Jen, go ahead. You can then move beyond understanding that issue and create a plan for action. So you can say, oh, where are there really strong relationships in the system that we can build upon? Or where is there a lack of relationships that we need to build? The actor map should not just be used one time. You can kind of go back to them over and over again. On the next slide, you'll see an example of one. Jen, sorry, you can just click all the way through all of it if there's animation. This you're not supposed to, again, understand, but this is an actor map that a collective impact initiative put together for all the positive and negative factors around children 0 to 8 in terms of the support structure. And so you can see all the different actors around here and try to map them by color. You can draw lines for those positive or negative or stronger or weaker relationships. So it can really help you understand who's missing from around the table. Who do we need to get involved? Who's really important on this issue? So that's just a visual. So we're a little bit behind on time, so we're probably only going to get through steps 1 and 2 today, but I wanted to make sure that you're able to at least practice steps 1 and 2 on this appreciative inquiry tool, and then we'll come back together. But the way this first step of appreciative inquiry works is you reflect on your own on a prompt, which I'll read in a moment, and then you're going to share your reflections with a partner. And that's where we'll have to stop today, just to respect everyone's time. But then typically what you do is get into groups of 4 to share your stories so you can start to hear where there's common or different themes from the story. So again, you should be able to see this in the link that I sent earlier, which I will resend right now. 1 second, in case you lost it. It's worksheet 2 in this Google Doc here or in the document that Jen sent around. So I'm going to just read this out loud and you can start reflecting on your own for 5 minutes and thinking about your response to this. So the instructions are to reflect and share a story about a positive systems change in which you have been involved. So reflect for a moment and remember a time when you were proud to be a part of a positive systems change in your current work or elsewhere. You felt alive, energized, and excited by what you saw and experienced. Things truly shifted in a substantive way that marked real progress. There were changes to policies, practices, and resource flows. Relationships were strengthened. Trust was built, and power dynamics started to shift. You could even begin to see mindsets changing. The shift was not noticed only by you, but many others as well. This was a time when you realized that real change was possible, when weeks, months, or even years of work showed signs of paying off and reaching the initiative's goal felt more possible than ever. So just close your eyes and think about a time. And then we'll ask you to kind of just jot down what that experience was like, responding to the questions of what were the tangible benefits and outcomes of this change? Who was there? What was your role? What core factor enabled this change to take place? And what were the qualities of leadership that effectively supported the change and made it happen? And then make sure, even if you start running out of time, to get to the 3 wishes question. This is really important when you're going to be sharing with your partner. If you had 3 wishes that would facilitate more systems change, success stories of the kind you just described, what would they be? So we're just going to take 3 or 4 minutes. Jen will play some music again if the technology cooperates, and then we'll send you off into pairs to share your story with one another, and then we'll come back together to kind of wrap up. And again, if you're not in a place where you can engage in this exercise, just stay in the main room, and we will be able to try to do some shuffling so you can share. Hey, welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your discussion. Apologies, it got cut short. So what I want to do to wrap up is just share how this would work if we were continuing. Normally doing this exercise does take, 30 minutes is pretty quick. I usually allocate 45 minutes to this exercise so you're not too rushed. So as you were listening to your partner's story, if we were going to go into the groups of 4, what I would have told you before the breakout is to really listen actively on the edge of your seat and be taking notes, because then what we would do is combine the pairs into groups of 4, where you would have to tell your partner's story, which is always really fun because you have to have done that active listening and remember the details. And then you get to hear your story through the eyes of someone else. So it's a really fun learning experience to then hear these stories, which are all so different and distinct, yet there's going to be a lot of commonality about, when you were at your best, when the community was at its best, what was that like? And so typically you share the stories, that takes 15 or 20 minutes, and then you might surface some of those common themes. And as a group, come back together and share out, what were the common themes across. And so what bubbles up from that is typically from this first appreciative inquiry exercise are a lot of ideas of what those key principles, those guiding principles might be in your common agenda of how you want to work together. So you'll hear things like there was cross-sector representation, there was a neutral facilitator, there was equity was a part of everything we were thinking about. We were keeping those with lived experience in mind or had them at the table. So kind of those commitments to how you want to work together will come out of it. And then likewise, if you move to step 2, which is visioning, you go through a similar kind of way of working of pairs and then groups and then themes, which can help you tease out some of the common themes that you want to see in your vision. So those are just 2 really helpful tools for both the guiding principles and the vision part of your common agenda. So just to wrap up, Jen, if you go to the next slide, this is, we'll share these slides after. As I mentioned, these are some facilitation resources that I find really helpful for systems leadership. There's a guide to facilitating intentional group learning by FSG, where I used to work. Liberating Structures is a website that has dozens of activities that you can read about how to kind of have interesting group dialogue. And then there was this online list of digital facilitation tools that I just recently found that in the age of COVID, where we may continue to have smaller or larger meetings virtually, this could be helpful for you as well. So all those links will be shared. So just to wrap up, as I mentioned, it's hard to believe we're in June. Our last session together will be on June 22nd. We're planning on sharing some thoughts on equity and measurement and evaluation, but we wanted to launch a quick poll to find out which topic are you most interested in hearing about during our final workshop. There's a list here. We'll just leave this open for about 30 seconds and vote for the one you're most interested in. Okay, 10 more seconds so we can end on time. Make your vote. All right, great. So most of you said community engagement, 55%. So that's really exciting. I'll make sure that we cover that topic. And my ask of you all is if you have great examples locally in your community of when community engagement has been done well, please come ready to share those. There will be another survey for you to share any additional feedback of what worked today, what didn't, so we can make any updates for our final session together. So with that, thank you all for your participation and interest, and I look forward to seeing you all in a few weeks. Jen, any other closing thoughts?
Nope, just fill out the survey and the email that you get after this, and we'll have this uploaded by close of business today to TCCY's YouTube page. Everybody have a great day. Melissa, Jen, and Mark, just wanted to thank you guys again for everything you've done, and I hope that y'all have a great rest of your day too.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Melissa. See you soon.